Moving into Willow Creek Estates seemed like the perfect retirement plan for Mr. Henderson. The 78-year-old veteran had spent his entire career as an aerospace engineer, contributing to projects that quite literally helped put satellites into orbit. He'd purchased the modest ranch-style home at the end of Maple Drive with his late wife's life insurance policy, hoping to spend his golden years tending to the garden she'd always dreamed of planting. The neighborhood seemed peaceful enough during his initial visit, with its pristine sidewalks and perfectly manicured lawns creating an atmosphere of suburban tranquility. What Mr. Henderson didn't know was that Willow Creek Estates was governed by one of the most stringent homeowners associations in the county, and that HOA was ruled with an iron fist by Karen Middleton, a woman who had transformed her position as HOA president into something resembling a small-scale dictatorship. I'd lived 3 houses down from Mr. Henderson for 5 years, and I'd watched Karen's reign of terror evolve from merely annoying to genuinely concerning. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and smash that like button. And if you want to hear more tales of HOA justice and entitled Karen behavior, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Trust me, this story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss how spectacularly this all unfolds. I first noticed something was wrong about 2 weeks after Mr. Henderson moved in. I was leaving for work early one morning when I saw Karen standing at the end of his driveway, her arms crossed and her face twisted into that particular expression of righteous indignation she wore so well. Mr. Henderson stood on his porch in his bathrobe, looking confused and a bit unsteady. Even from a distance, I could hear Karen's shrill voice carrying across the quiet morning air. "Your mailbox is not regulation height." According to Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B of the HOA bylaws, all mailboxes must be exactly 42 inches from ground level to the bottom of the mailbox. Yours is at 44 inches. I'm issuing you a citation, and you have 72 hours to correct this violation or face a $50 fine. I paused by my car, watching this interaction with growing disbelief. The elderly man was squinting at Karen, clearly struggling to understand why someone was yelling at him about 2 inches of mailbox height before 7 in the morning. I made a mental note to introduce myself to him properly later, maybe warn him about Karen's tendencies. What I didn't realize was that this mailbox incident was just the opening salvo in what would become a months-long campaign of harassment. Over the following weeks, the citations piled up. Karen cited Mr. Henderson for having his garbage cans visible from the street 15 minutes before the designated time. She cited him for a small oil stain on his driveway that appeared after his home health aide's car had been parked there. She cited him for having a garden gnome that exceeded the permitted height for lawn decorations by 3 inches. Each citation came with a fine, and each fine added to the growing financial and emotional burden on a man living on a fixed income. I started keeping track of the citations after I witnessed Karen berating Mr. Henderson in his own front yard over the color of his garden hose. Apparently, only forest green hoses were permitted, and his was sage green. The distinction was virtually invisible to the human eye, but Karen had brought out a color wheel and was insisting that his hose violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. Mr. Henderson's hands were shaking as he tried to explain that he just purchased the hose from the hardware store and hadn't realized there were specific color requirements. That evening, I knocked on Mr. Henderson's door with a casserole and a friendly smile. He invited me in, grateful for the company, and over dinner he told me his story. His wife had passed away 2 years prior after a long battle with cancer. He'd moved to Willow Creek Estates hoping for a fresh start, somewhere peaceful where he could enjoy his remaining years without the memories that haunted his old house. Instead, he'd found himself under constant attack from a woman who seemed to delight in making his life miserable. "I don't understand what I've done wrong," he said softly, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I've tried to follow all the rules. I've paid every fine, even though some of them seem excessive. But no matter what I do, she finds something else to complain about. Yesterday she told me my welcome mat was too worn and needed to be replaced. It belonged to my wife. It's one of the few things I brought with me that reminds me of her. The defeat in his voice stirred something in me. I'd dealt with Karen's pettiness before. 3 years ago, she tried to fine me for having solar panels installed without HOA approval, despite the fact that state law explicitly prohibited HOAs from denying solar panel installations. I'd fought back using my background in real estate law, and she'd backed down. But I was younger, healthier, and had the resources to fight. Mr. Henderson was vulnerable, and Karen had clearly identified him as an easy target. I started attending the monthly HOA meetings, something I'd avoided for years, because they were typically mind-numbing affairs where Karen held court and rubber-stamped her own decisions. At the next meeting, I raised my concerns about the excessive citations being issued to Mr. Henderson. I pointed out that many of the violations were extraordinarily minor, and that the frequency of citations seemed designed more to harass than to maintain neighborhood standards. Karen's response was immediate and condescending. The rules apply to everyone equally. If Mr. Henderson is receiving citations, it's because he's violating our community standards. Perhaps if he spent less time complaining and more time maintaining his property to our specifications, he wouldn't have these problems. Some people simply aren't suited for life in a community with standards. The other board members, all handpicked by Karen over the years, nodded in agreement. I looked around the room at my neighbors, many of whom avoided eye contact. They knew what Karen was doing was wrong, but they were too afraid of becoming her next target to speak up. That's when I realized that defeating Karen would require more than just arguing at HOA meetings. It would require strategy, patience, and a willingness to use every resource at my disposal. My background isn't something I typically advertise around the neighborhood. After graduating law school, I'd spent 15 years working in corporate real estate law before transitioning into real estate development. I'd made some very successful investments, diversified into commercial properties, and eventually semi-retired at 45 to pursue consulting work. I maintained my law license, kept up with continuing education, and still had connections throughout the legal and real estate communities. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. I started by doing what I do best, research. I obtained a complete copy of the HOA bylaws, the articles of incorporation, and every amendment that had been passed over the years. I reviewed 5 years of meeting minutes, financial records, and citation histories. What I discovered was damning. Karen had been selectively enforcing rules, issuing citations to people she didn't like while ignoring identical violations by her friends. She'd approved expenditures without proper board votes. She'd increased her own salary as HOA president 3 times in 2 years, something that required a vote of the general membership that had never occurred. But more importantly, I discovered that under the current bylaws, which Karen herself had pushed through 4 years ago, any homeowner could call for a special election to recall board members if they obtained signatures from 25% of the homeowners. Willow Creek Estates had 120 homes. I needed 30 signatures. I started with Mr. Henderson's immediate neighbors. The Patels, who lived next door, had received citations for having cars parked in their driveway during their daughter's wedding reception. The Johnsons across the street had been fined for their child's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. The Rodriguezes had been cited for having their sprinklers on during unauthorized hours, despite the fact that Karen's own lawn was being watered on the exact same schedule. One by one, I collected signatures, along with documented instances of Karen's selective enforcement and financial irregularities. Meanwhile, Karen's harassment of Mr. Henderson escalated. She began conducting property inspections of his home multiple times a week, always finding new violations. His doorbell was the wrong finish. His house numbers were a quarter-inch too small. The mulch in his flower beds was cedar instead of the required pine. The fines accumulated, and I could see the toll it was taking on him. He looked thinner, more tired, and the spark of joy that had been in his eyes when he'd first moved in had been replaced by a constant anxiety. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was working from home when I heard shouting outside. I looked out my window to see Karen standing in Mr. Henderson's front yard, gesturing wildly at his flower garden. Mr. Henderson was on his knees in the dirt, where he'd apparently been planting bulbs. His walker was beside him, and he was struggling to stand up. Karen was looming over him, her voice getting louder with each sentence. I was out my door and across the street in seconds. As I got closer, I could hear what she was saying, and it made my blood boil. These are not approved flowering plants. The HOA landscaping guidelines clearly state that only plants from the approved list may be planted in front yards. These appear to be tulips, which require a variance request submitted in writing at least 60 days before planting. I'm issuing you a citation for unauthorized plantings, and these will need to be removed immediately. Do you understand me? Are you even listening? Mr. Henderson was trying to respond, but he seemed disoriented. His face was flushed, and he was struggling to catch his breath. That's when I realized he wasn't just upset, he was having a medical emergency. I pushed past Karen and knelt beside him. Mr. Henderson, can you hear me? Are you having chest pain? He nodded weakly, his hand moving to his chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, clearly stating the address, and that we had an elderly man experiencing possible cardiac symptoms. Karen stood there, her citation book still in her hand, looking annoyed at the interruption. This doesn't change the fact that he's in violation of the landscaping rules, she said. Those tulips will still need to be removed. I looked up at her, and I must have had an expression on my face that finally penetrated her self-absorbed bubble, because she actually took a step back. Those tulips were his wife's favorite flower. He's planting them because today would have been their 55th wedding anniversary. And if you don't walk away right now, I'm going to make it my personal mission to ensure you never have authority over another human being in this neighborhood again. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. The paramedics stabilized Mr. Henderson and transported him to the hospital. He'd had a heart attack, brought on by stress and exacerbated by Karen's harassment. I rode with him in the ambulance, and I sat with him in the emergency room until his daughter arrived from 2 states away. When she asked me what had happened, I told her everything. Her name was Patricia, and she was a family law attorney. We spoke for over an hour in the hospital waiting room while her father was being evaluated by the cardiologists. I explained the months of harassment, the excessive citations, the constant stress that had been placed on her father. I showed her the documentation I'd been collecting. And then I told her about my plan to recall Karen and the rest of the HOA board. That's a good start, Patricia said, her jaw tight with anger. But it's not enough. My father almost died because of this woman's petty power trip. A recall election is fine, but I want her held accountable. Legally. I smiled, because Patricia was speaking my language. Over the next hour, we crafted a strategy that went far beyond a simple HOA recall. We were going to dismantle Karen's little empire brick by brick, and we were going to do it using the very rules and systems she weaponized against others. First, the recall election. I'd been collecting signatures quietly, but now I went public. I created a website documenting every violation of HOA bylaws that Karen had committed, every instance of selective enforcement, every financial irregularity. I included video footage from doorbell cameras showing Karen harassing Mr. Henderson and other residents. I included copies of citations issued for absurd violations alongside photos showing that Karen's own property had identical violations that went uncited. Within 48 hours, I had signatures from 73 homeowners, more than double what was required. I submitted the recall petition, and a special election was scheduled for 3 weeks later. But that was just the beginning. Patricia, working with my documentation, filed a civil lawsuit against Karen personally for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and elder abuse. The elder abuse charge was particularly serious because Mr. Henderson was a protected person under state law, and Karen's pattern of behavior met the legal definition of financial exploitation and emotional abuse. We also filed complaints with the State Real Estate Commission regarding Karen's management of HOA funds, since she acted as a property manager by virtue of her HOA role. Then I reached out to every homeowner who'd ever received a citation from Karen. 42 families agreed to join a class action lawsuit against the HOA itself for selective enforcement of covenants, seeking refunds of all fines paid and damages for the stress and financial harm caused by Karen's arbitrary rule enforcement. Because I documented that Karen had been acting outside her authority as HOA president and violating the association's own bylaws, the HOA's insurance company immediately began settlement negotiations to avoid a protracted legal battle they would certainly lose. But I wasn't done. Remember how I mentioned my background in real estate development? Willow Creek Estates had been built 20 years ago by a developer who'd retained ownership of several parcels within the subdivision, including a 3-acre lot at the main entrance that had been designated for potential commercial development. That lot had sat vacant for 2 decades, slowly appreciating in value. The original developer had passed away, and the property had gone through probate and ended up being sold to settle the estate. I bought it. I paid cash, closed in 2 weeks, and suddenly I owned the most prominent piece of real estate in Willow Creek Estates. The property was specifically exempted from HOA covenants because it predated the association and had been designated for commercial use in the original development plans. Karen couldn't touch it. Now, here's where my understanding of local zoning law and my connections in the development community came into play. The property was zoned for mixed-use development, meaning I could build residential or commercial structures. I filed plans with the county for a small assisted living facility, specifically designed for elderly residents who needed support but wanted to maintain independence. It would have 20 units, landscaped grounds, a community garden, and would be professionally managed. And Mr. Henderson would live there rent-free for life as part of my settlement with him for failing to protect him adequately as a neighbor. So would any other elderly resident of Willow Creek Estates who wanted to escape Karen's harassment. The facility would be called Henderson Gardens, and those tulips his wife loved? They'd be planted all around the property, visible from the main entrance of Willow Creek Estates, where every single resident would drive past them every single day. But wait, there's more. Because the property sat at the main entrance, and because it was exempt from HOA control, I also had the right to alter the entrance to the subdivision. The gaudy stone monument sign that Karen had spent $40,000 of HOA funds installing 3 years ago? It sat partially on my property due to an easement that the developer had granted but that I, as the new owner, had the right to revoke with 90 days' notice. I revoked it. The sign would need to be removed or relocated entirely onto HOA property, which would cost the association approximately $30,000 to dismantle and rebuild. And that's assuming they could find space for it, which they couldn't because the only suitable location was also on my property. The recall election happened on a Thursday evening in the subdivision's clubhouse. Every seat was filled, and dozens of homeowners stood along the walls. Karen sat at the front table with her hand-picked board members, confident that the silent majority of homeowners who never attended meetings would vote to maintain the status quo. She was wrong. The vote was 98-12 in favor of recalling the entire board. Karen's face went from confident to confused to angry in the span of about 30 seconds as the votes were tallied. But she still didn't understand the full scope of what was coming. The new board, elected that same evening, consisted of the Patels, the Johnsons, Patricia Henderson, myself, and 2 other homeowners who'd been vocal critics of Karen's overreach. Our first act was to vote to suspend all pending citations pending a comprehensive review. Our second act was to vote to refund all fines collected in the past 2 years, given the evidence of selective enforcement. Our third act was to terminate Karen's salary as HOA president and to hire an independent management company to handle day-to-day operations. Karen stood up, her face purple with rage. "You can't do this. I've dedicated years to this community. I've maintained our standards. I've kept our property values high." Patricia stood up calmly and handed Karen an envelope. "This is a summons. You're being sued for elder abuse, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. You're also being investigated by the State Real Estate Commission for financial irregularities in your management of HOA funds. We've documented over 140 instances of selective enforcement, 17 violations of HOA bylaws in your own conduct, and 3 instances of unauthorized expenditures totaling over $70,000. Karen's hand shook as she opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the first page of the lawsuit, and I watched the blood drain from her face as she realized every interaction, every citation, every petty harassment had been documented. "There's more," I said, standing up. "I'm sure you're familiar with the vacant lot at the subdivision entrance? I've purchased it. I'm breaking ground next month on Henderson Gardens, an assisted living facility. Your authority ends at the property line of each homeowner's lot. You have no power over common areas anymore, and you certainly have no power over my commercial property. That monument sign you're so proud of? It's being removed in 87 days because it sits on my property, and I'm revoking the easement." Karen looked like she'd been slapped. "You can't. The entrance will look. The entrance will look exactly how I want it to look," I continued. "I'm thinking a nice garden with a fountain. Maybe a memorial bench dedicated to Mr. Henderson's wife. And speaking of Mr. Henderson, he's recovering nicely from the heart attack you triggered. He'll be moving into Henderson Gardens as soon as it's complete, where he'll be able to plant all the tulips he wants without someone with a clipboard and a color wheel harassing him." The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was on Karen as the reality of her situation sank in. She'd lost her position, lost her power, was facing multiple lawsuits, a state investigation, and a permanent monument to her failure was going to sit at the entrance to the neighborhood she tried to rule like a petty tyrant. One of her former allies on the old board spoke up quietly. "Karen, I think you should leave now." Karen looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who would support her. But she'd burned too many bridges, harassed too many people, and abused her power too flagrantly. Every face looked back at her with a mixture of satisfaction and contempt. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she tried to formulate a response. Finally, she grabbed her citation book, her copies of the bylaws, and her purse, and walked toward the door. She paused at the threshold and turned back. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking. "Actually," Patricia said, standing up with a folder full of legal documents, "it is. And if you attempt to contact my father, any resident of this subdivision, or set foot on HOA common property, will add stalking and trespassing to the existing charges. Your reign of terror is done, Karen. You're done." Karen's face crumpled as the full weight of her defeat crashed down on her. The citations, the fines, the petty harassment, all of it had been her source of power and identity. And in one evening, It had all been stripped away. Not just stripped away, but turned into her permanent legacy of failure. Every time she drove into her own neighborhood, she'd see Henderson Gardens. She'd see those tulips. She'd be reminded that her cruelty had consequences, and that sometimes the people you underestimate are the most dangerous enemies you can make. She stood there in the doorway, her citation book clutched to her chest like a security blanket, finally understanding that she'd systematically harassed the wrong elderly man in front of the wrong neighbor. The look on her face was one of complete and utter devastation as she realized that her own rules, her own obsessive documentation, her own paper trail had become the evidence that destroyed her. She'd built her own cage citation by citation, fine by fine, and now she was locked inside it while the rest of the neighborhood moved forward without her. If you made it to the end of this epic tale of HOA justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. I post news stories of entitled people getting what they deserve every week. Drop a comment and let me know what you think Karen's face looked like when she realized she'd been completely outplayed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.